my heart. I do believe we shall overcome someday.
We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
We are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid. Someday, oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
We are not alone. We are not alone. We are not alone someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
The whole wide world around, the whole wide world around, the whole wide world around someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Wow. I would say, and I know Pastor Harris would agree with me, that our night is already a success, and neither of us have said really a word. So thank you so much, Christy. Thank you so much, Ernest, for introducing this evening. Or I think we're supposed to click our fingers. All right, welcome. I'm just going to offer a quick review of our first session. And when reading the first chapter of the book of Exodus, we spoke of how quickly people fell into slavery. We talked about how a word like sharetz in Hebrew can take on the meaning of vermin as it is in the creation story, and how a people can suddenly be turned into something subhuman. We also thought about how a victimizer can think of themselves as victims. The fear of the Israelites and the whole notion that they will grow and grow and grow, and should they be attacked, they'll become a fifth column siding with their enemies. And we talked about how easily fear can crystallize into the dehumanization of people to the point that the firstborn sons could be killed and a whole people would participate, with the exception of two women, Shifra and Pua, who we'll talk about again tonight. The bulk of our conversation was the power of othering, of putting other people outside of the larger group. We spoke of the impact of othering on the Black community. We spoke about the impact of othering on the Jewish community. And we looked at our own society and discussed what a powerful force it is to this day, and what a destructive force it remains. And if anyone needs a lesson in othering, then simply look at the trial that is beginning of Derek Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd. And all of us have seen that video, and how a person could choke another person to death while the person was saying, "I can't breathe," and allow them to die without any sense of emotion on their face, is a picture of what othering can produce, not only in the time of Moses, but in our time as well. Chris?
You know, I tell you, it's always a pleasure to be with my brother from another mother, Rabbi Siegel, and to all of you all, our friends over at Anshe Emet. And I also share that the singing was amazing as always. Think about the othering. Right now, the world is facing what othering looks like. It's all over the news. Everybody is talking about it. Those who watched it, Oprah Winfrey, famed television show host and one who is absolutely skilled at asking questions and provoking answers that provoke conversation, whether comfortable or uncomfortable. Most recently, sat down and met with who we acknowledge as Princess Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and then who we proudly call Prince Archie. It's pretty amazing what we have seen in the other end. Racism peeks his head up once again because Meghan Markle, the princess, has now ended up as a woman who has Blackness in her. Mother, Black. And now the child has Blackness in him. What a blessing. What a blessing. However, not everyone see it that way. One of the things that broke our hearts in the African American community, even now, is the fact that there can also be racism in royalty, right? Just think about that. If there was ever a time that this kind of situation should be talked about, this is that moment. Who would have thought that even being royal does not protect you from racism? Even the question when Oprah asked Meghan, tell us about some of the challenges of you being in the royal family, and she happened to bring up the fact that she and Prince Harry decided to leave the royal family, and a lot of the things that has been seen in the media was not necessarily true. So she decided, we'll tell our own story. He decided they'll tell their own story. The baby is unfortunately not able to speak for itself at this moment. And just think about it. here it is, the question was brought up. What were some of the challenges? And she raised, Megan that is, that the question was asked, how would they deal with the fact that the child's skin may be darker? They asked questions about that. How will they handle that the child's skin would be darker? If you look at the news media, since Meghan came on the scene in the royal family, she could be doing the same thing that Prince William's wife was doing. For example, holding and cradling the baby while in the belly of the mother. For one, it was a beautiful scene when it comes to William's wife. But when it came to Meghan, they called it horrific. They said negative things about it, right? This is othering. In the media, they said that Meghan was in there causing trouble and she made William's wife cry, when in fact the interview showed it was just the opposite. That William's wife, the princess, made Meghan cry. So othering is an issue, and it always happens. And in our community, we are challenged to deal with it and show what we call tonight, which is the subject of our class, resistance. And the question must be asked, was the interview with Oprah a form of resistance? Or will some see it as a publicity stunt? This is why in our conversations tonight, in our conversation last week and next week, and we want to hear from you. Matter of fact, you can take a moment now and go into the chat and start to tell us what your thoughts are. We want to hear from you. The goal of this class with Michael and I sharing and leading this conversation, facilitating, is not only that you hear from us, but we also get the privilege to hear from you. Those of y'all that have not watched the interview, I encourage you, go and check it out with Oprah, Meghan, and Harry talking about this royal issue. And we do believe that if they thought there was going to be ripples when Princess Diana did interviews, that will literally pale compared to this one. We are thoroughly convinced that this will be a discussion, yet another discussion on race. And what we have the responsibility to do in this group, in these congregations, is be adult enough, mature enough, courageous enough to have these uncomfortable conversations and face it. And wherever we, in our commitment and being in relationship with one another, wherever we see racism, wherever we see anti-Semitism, how do we face it? And how do we, like David with Goliath, bring that giant down?
And Chris, this is really what I love about these conversations, and this is what I respect so much about you, is that you come right to the point, and you're fearless about that. You raised that question we spoke earlier today about whether or not that interview between Oprah, Harry, and Meghan was an act of resistance. There will be those out there that will say that it was shamelessly exploitative, or that it was disrespectful on Harry's part. But I guess the question is, was it an act of resistance? And I want to just note that Alice writes that the point that racism was alleged against a member of the royal family when a large percentage of the Queen's subjects in the Commonwealth are people of color is a powerful statement. And then Michelle writes, Meghan and Harry were sharing their truth, which is a powerful form of resistance. As a mixed race woman who is also expecting a daughter, I literally bawled. And that is the effect of this. And I imagine that this will also give other people courage, right? And I just want to then add Abe Trieger to this. Writes, interesting about the royals deciding that the race of the mother, Meghan, dictates the race of the child is a remnant of slavery. The child of a white slave owner who impregnated his female slave was considered to be black, even though in all other areas of law and custom, a child inherited the rights of the father. Tanisha writes, women of color, particularly black women, have also had our narrative precede us, even when it's not accurate. it's always easier to depict us in a negative manner and be believed. So this is, I mean, this does speak to this, doesn't
Yeah.
it, Chris? I mean, I think that these comments are amazing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the amazing things is the fact that, we've had this discussion um, in our Christian circles, right? Is the identity of the Jewish child uh, based on the father or the mother, right? That's why these questions that many people ask. And then today, let me just take a moment, give a big shout out to all of the amazing women on International Women's Day. Big shout out to all of you all for your power and your contribution. So grateful. But we talk about this powerful woman who, as you said, Michael, some will say she should not have done it. Many will say, thank you, Megan, for doing it. I even made a post earlier today. Pray for the baby, right? Pray for the baby, because the baby will literally grow up to realize that not racism, let me say what I wanted to say, anti-Blackness, right? And in some cases, white privilege was the cause of this. You may not understand it until you listen to the interview, right? But right in the royal family, or in the institution, as it was called. I also said that, shout out to Prince Harry for protecting his wife, his amazing wife, and his child. I mean, think about all that he has lost and is willing to lose for the sake of family. This is resistance at its best, from my perspective.
So someone asked about the Jewish view of inheritance and status. So what's interesting that in the Bible, status is passed through the father.
That's right.
But according to Jewish law, status is actually passed through the mother. And this change came in the Greco-Roman period, when that was Greco-Roman law, because you always knew who the mother was. This was the kind of the logic of it. So in some people, so that status issue remains in some areas of Jewish law. But I want to kind of bring us back to resistance for once, and as we continue on, because I think what we all know is the courage to resist can be expressed in many ways. And as Chris said so eloquently, and other people in their own way, it is a very, very powerful argument to say that Harry and Meghan were involved in an act of resistance, and there was no violence, and armed resistance is one of many ways to be resistant. We're going to talk about that, and the whole notion that resistance is an inner quality, not just an action. It starts with courage, which comes from the inside. And for some people, just getting out of bed in the morning is an act of courage. If a person has been subjected to overwhelming hardship, or a person who has been put down in some way, or a person who has been turned out of job after job after job, to not allow the system to crush you is an act of resistance, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think so for sure. I think allowing your last sentence, right? One of the things that really struck me, and Regina Kreider just said it here in the statement, said Prince Harry refused to allow history to repeat itself, in reference to what happened with his mother, Princess Diana. That took a great deal of courage, and it may be necessary, even when it is not popular, right? A lot of times you have to stand up and make decisions that a lot of people will not necessarily agree with or see eye to eye, but that courage that is required. I mean, we'll talk about them tonight. Again, Shifra and Pua, that took tremendous courage. More great women that we celebrate today on International Women's Day. That's powerful. And I think where we identify it, we probably have to replicate it.
So just as we did last week, we're going to turn our attention to the text.
Yep.
And here we're going to pick up with Shifra and Pua, but we're going to be looking at resistance as we turn to the second chapter of the book of Exodus. And what we're going to ask you to do is to note the moments of resistance as we read through this. So I'm going to choose from Anshe as one reader, and then we'll choose someone from Bright Star. I'm going to choose Phil Stern. And Chris, who are you choosing from Bright Star?
As I scroll through, since it's International Women's Day, let's have Regina. Regina, are you able to unmute?
Oops.
Yes, I'm here.
Wait,
Thank you.
Awesome. We're gonna put it on the screen, and when it's your turn, you'll read your scriptures.
Give me 1 second. I'm sorry. Here we are. Can everybody see that okay?
We can.
All righty. I'm going to ask Phil to start. Well, actually, no. Let's have Regina start. We're starting in the end of chapter 1, verse 15. Regina?
Okay.
And how many verses, Rabbi, do you want her to read?
I think what we're going to do is we're going to have her go to chapter 2. And no, actually, we'll, give me 1 second to figure this out. I think we're just going to have her read through verse 6 of chapter 2, and then Phil will ask you to pick it up.
Thanks.
And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when ye do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. And the king of Egypt called for the midwives, and said unto them, why have ye done this thing, and have saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women, for they are lively and are delivered. Oh, I can't see. Delivered are the midwives come in unto them. Therefore, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. And the Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter
Shall live.
Yes.
Sorry about it. I moved up too quickly.
Yes, you did. And there went a man of the house Levi, and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him, that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark. Of bulrushes, and doubled it and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags where the river brink. And his sisters stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and the maidens walked along by the riverside. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children.
I'm going to move this up, and thank you so much. And we're going to move on to Phil now.
Then,
You're welcome.
then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew woman, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter. and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, because I drew him out of the water. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, two men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to them that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. He moved up pretty fast there. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they came to rule their father, he said, how is that ye are come so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us of the hand of the shepherds and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. And he said unto his daughters, and where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah his daughter. And she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom. For he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. And it came to pass in process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard the groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Phil. Thank you for our readers. So, okay,
Amazing.
yeah,
You
say the
know,
least.
I mean, as you look at this, we're asking people again to consider the varied forms of resistance, right? We'll ask everybody now to think about that.
Yeah, and put in the chat as, let me do this. It's hard because if I put the text up on the chat, then I don't think you can see that. If I put the text up, I don't think you can see the chat.
Right.
So I'm gonna just, I'm gonna just summarize what happened.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we read about was Shifra and Pua and their unwillingness to accept the law of Pharaoh and resist. So that's an easy one, isn't it? That's an easy form of resistance. But what follows? We find that there is a family. Now we've moved from Shifra and Pua, we've moved from the Egyptian universe and Pharaoh, and now the story takes us into the home of an Israelite family during the time of this edict. And this family bears a son, and the son is growing, and the son is 3 months old. And what are they going to do? What are they going to do? And so they put him in a wicker basket, and they send it into the Nile. And somehow this child ends up with Pharaoh's daughter. Anybody have a thought about whether this is an act of resistance? Okay. What kind of, so type into the chat if you think this is a form of resistance. How would you classify this form of resistance? What is the form of resistance?
Michael, I'll start while people are starting to put things in there in the chat. Jay says there, Pharaoh's daughter defied her father's ruling. Powerful. the mother resisted and the princess resisted, another person said. What is resisting of the law, right, is pretty powerful. Um, I think one of the things that you notice when you think about this, not only resisting of the law, resisting of the father's requirement, it is also resisting death itself, the threat of death, right? I think it's pretty amazing. And it takes tremendous courage for them to take those steps.
So let me just build on this for a second, because if you look at the language,
Yeah.
I'm just going to just and I'll emphasize this. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levi woman. So the Torah doesn't even bother giving us their names. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him, caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. Who are the resistors here? Where's the husband? Where's Amram, the husband, right? They're exactly, Regina, they're all women.
All of them.
All women. And I just would mention that the rabbis who comment on this also tell the story of how women in the generation of Moses never lost faith. The husbands gave up. They said, I don't want to bring a child into this world if they're only going to be destroyed. The women are the ones who demanded that they conceive children of their husbands. And here the Torah seems to be underscoring the role of women in this story. Again, we have Shifra and Puah, but now we have these women, right?
Yeah.
And so Sarah Herson says Moses owes his life to so many women: Shifra and Puah, Yocheved, Miriam, and the late Zipporah. Right? So this is really pretty remarkable.
Well, this is
also is the daughter of Pharaoh. Yes.
And this is certainly not to diminish the role of men, but let's enjoy this amazing holiday today, right? There is a bearing that women have to experience that men do not, right? There is that level of commitment to what they have carried and they are carrying. And I think for lack of a better term, I wonder if the motherhood or the women of the woman in, forgive the terminology, in Shifra and Puah, I wonder if it was just the respect for God. I wonder if it was, or the reverence for God. I wonder if it was, what if this was my child? It makes me wonder, right? As we look at all of these amazing, as William Goldberg says, women are the historic resistors. It makes me wonder what else was there.
Yeah. I also think what the Torah is doing, and we're talking about resistance. If you look at Egyptian society, right? So the Hebrews are on the lowest rung, but the men are still above the women in this Egyptian hierarchy.
Yes.
So the weakest, most vulnerable group amongst these people are women.
Mm-hmm.
And who are the resistors to the most powerful man in the world, to Pharaoh?
Yes.
It's the women. And because of their acts of resistance, ultimately they are setting the foundation for what's going to follow. Small but powerful acts of resistance.
Imagine the penalty, right? Imagine the thought of the penalty, the courage that was there. Jojo said here, my wife Jojo, she said that hierarchy is still in place today.
In the Harris home, by the way.
Yeah. That was pretty good, Mike.
Thank you.
You know I could text Janet right now and get some backup right here, right?
Yeah, I'm quite sure that you could. But I think that I think we are struggling right now. I mean, what's going on in New York with the governor, and these are real issues in our society that continue to this very day. But I Gail Golden asked the question, because as the story moves on, we have to look at Pharaoh's daughter, who's known as Batya in the Jewish tradition. And Gail wants to know, how do you know that the princess knew this child was Jewish? And what do you think? And anybody have an answer to that question? How would she think, right? How can we? What do you think?
Come on, Michael. We all saw the movie, The 10 Commandments, right?
Right. No, it's true, but because who else would do this?
Yeah.
Who else would put their baby in a basket? Who else would do this act of desperation, right? Who would do that? And what's also interesting is that the women took the child, and what does the child do? The child cries, and she hears the cry, and she herself is moved by this. And I'm underscoring this because I'm going to come back to it in a few minutes. But the people around her say, they shall I go? Then his sister said, so Miriam is standing there. She's gone to follow the basket. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you? Now, I want you to think for a minute. This is basically broadcasting that this is a Hebrew child. Now, if you didn't know how this story was going to play out, what would you think was about to happen to Miriam and this baby in a society where the owner of that palace has given an edict to kill every firstborn male child?
Yeah, imminent.
That's right. And that's not what happens. What happens instead is that the Pharaoh's daughter gives this child over so it can be suckled. So we're assuming that Miriam is actually taking the child back to the mother Yocheved, and she's nursing the child, and then this child will be raised in the house of Pharaoh. All women resistors. And this is a powerful statement. Now, the men are going to rise up, and as Samantha DeKoven notes, this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not men against women and all the rest. Even though we were kidding around a moment ago, men and women are going to play a role in this resistance. But I do think it's notable that it starts with women. So those are a couple.
I think we should also point out the hand of God in resistance, right? Because if you notice in this child, there was no navigation system, right? I believe that we do God a disservice if we do not acknowledge his hand, his participation in resistance. I think it's pretty powerful where the baby started and where the baby ended up, right? And I think that is of the divine will of God, right? I think a lot of times we are afraid of what we would face. We are concerned about the imminent danger. But I think as people of faith, from the Christian perspective, it is pretty amazing. And preachers would just have a field day with this part of seeing the divine hand of God guiding the baby, right, to the place of destiny, right, in the face of danger. That is a powerful thing. And I think as we think about this resistance piece, right, resistance, we would talk about this in a moment and give some examples. Resistance to cruelty often begins with very small acts of courage, and it starts to build from there, because that's a very cruel thing to make a law and say, kill them all, right? Kill them all, to make sure that we get the one we're looking for, kill them all. Make sure this is done away with, right? And these small acts of resistance actually matter, right? And I think we see it in different ways. Can I give you a couple of examples?
Please go ahead.
Dr. King. Let's look at the resistance. Dr. King. If this session is about slavery and to the path of redemption, you think about the resistance that people like Dr. King who gave, and he said, let's resist, but let's be nonviolent. And then you think about the historic, amazing contribution of a patriarch called Congressman John Lewis, who encouraged all of us to find good trouble, right? That is, whoever called trouble good, right? Except people like John Lewis. And then when you think about people like Gandhi and Mandela, these are individuals that from the African-American experience, we say, wait a minute, look at these different levels of resistance that we saw from these kinds of individuals. Again, it has to start with small acts of resistance, but they still matter. Small acts of courage, and then you build it from there. You get one win, great, what's next? Another win, great, what's next? Dealing with the civil rights movement and having both African-American and Jewish people coming together to say, we're going to resist together, right, is pretty amazing.
Look, I want to take a minute and unpack good trouble.
Please.
I think it's such a fascinating phrase, right? As you said, we normally attach negative connotations to the word trouble.
Yeah.
There's a good kind of trouble, but I think underneath it, there is a sense that there are limits to passive resistance, that you need to, and there are lines that are drawn, and you cannot simply do nothing.
Yeah.
You can't take Amram's approach that we're assuming in this story. You have to have the faith and the courage to go forward. And so that kind of good trouble is the willingness to take a stand and do things that would normally feel unacceptable, but because of the circumstances, they're the only right thing to do. The only right thing. Would you agree with that? Is that a fair understanding, or would you push off against it?
No. I agree with you 100%, right? And I think it was Dr. King who, again, paraphrasing his amazing words, but we won't remember the noise of our enemies. We're going to remember the silence of our friends, right? There are times where you need to, three things. Number one, you got to show up, right? And then the second thing is you have to stand up. And then the third thing you have to do is speak up, right? If you're not going to show up, if you're not going to stand up, if you're not going to speak up, then you're not ready for good trouble. And if we stay silent, right, then we give credence to, and in some ways, our silence makes us complicit, right? If we are not willing to stand up for good trouble and show up, stand up and speak up, then guess what? Our social media posts and our personal opinions mean nothing. We have to have the courage.
Right. So you look at somebody like Rosa Parks, right?
Right.
And, what does it mean, in today's world? Oh, she took a seat, which was not in that section. But, in that universe, when people of color had virtually no power in the Old South, where they couldn't even use bathrooms or drinking fountains, right? Where they were really being treated as subhuman in every possible way. That was an incredible act of courage and resistance that changed the world. And I think that, and we're going to kind of unpack this a little bit more later, but there are times when you can resist and change the world. And there are other times when there are more silent forms of resistance as well. I want to just think about the Jewish struggle as well. And I want to go back to the period of the Holocaust.
Yes.
Because one of the real challenges is this notion that Jews went to like sheep to slaughter. We need to remember that the world had closed its doors.
Right.
right? And this was long before. Well, actually, this was the original version of America First. But the world knew what was happening in Europe, and imagine that a ship called the St. Louis was right outside of the Miami harbor, but it was sent back. Imagine this, sent back to Germany, right? Not all, on the one hand, it does have some similarity to the slave laws that returned runaway slaves to their owners. But in this particular case, this was going to mean death to most of these people, and our State Department knew it. And so when you are powerless in a society, how do you resist? How do you resist? Maybe by maintaining your dignity, not becoming subhuman. One of the great stories of the Holocaust is that in the ghettos in Warsaw, in Lodz, all through Eastern Europe, Jews created schools. Jews created soup kitchens. And it's a remarkable story of what they did for each other during that time. And in going even into the camps is a form of resistance that people kept they would use potato peels, and they would light the Hanukkah candles in the concentration camps, knowing that this could be a death sentence. And so there are all kinds of forms of resistance, but also I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge righteous Gentiles who hid Jews for years at times, who did remarkable things that are beyond brave. And at the Holocaust Museum, which we visited together, Chris, we've walked through we've walked and looked at the forest of the righteous Gentiles, where trees are planted for people who acted, and non-Jews who risked their lives to save others. And so that is a remarkable statement about resistance as well, that we shouldn't forget, that we have a role to play in the lives of others. And I think that that's such a big part of what we're trying to do with this conversation, and between Bright Star and Anshe Emet, is to be there for each other as we go forward.
That's exactly right. If I were to put another example of resistance from a hymnal or old Negro spiritual perspective, it would sound something like this. Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. Those who were facing being brought over to America, we are the only immigrants who came to America in chains and against our will. And then when we got here, still in chains, and had to try to flee the South to go up to the North. Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, so many others. And then after dealing with being brought over in chains, still enslaved in chains, building a country for others to benefit from. And then now we can honestly say that this generation, this current generation, would say they changed the chains to handcuffs, incarceration, mass incarceration. If anybody want to take the time to read the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, these are things that help people to learn and understand. When you think about the book that Dr. Joy DeGruy wrote, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and there's so much resistance that needs to take place. But what I honestly am concerned about is the younger generation that didn't have to flee and they didn't have to fight, and they take for granted the freedoms that they enjoy now.
That was beautiful, but I will regret singing after you, but I will do it anyway.
Please do,
But
my friend.
here is a song in Hebrew, which I'll translate, that was sung by Jews on those cattle cars on the way to the camps. Ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, ani ma'amin, be'emunah shlema, beviat hamashiach, beviat hamashiach ani ma'amin. אף על פי שיתממע, אני מאמין. It means I believe with a full heart in the coming of the Messiah. And even though the Messiah may tarry, I continue to believe. Now imagine singing that in a concentration camp. Imagine singing that on a cattle car. Sometimes the only thing that you can do is express your faith, and that may be, and not give up and not turn your back on life, but continue to believe even to your dying breath in the goodness of God and in the goodness of the world and the hope for the future. To me, that is also a remarkable statement of resistance, just as that beautiful spiritual that you sang a moment ago was an act of powerful resistance. The fact that, I mean, think about this, the fact that when slave owners wanted to bring the Christian message to their slaves and taught them the Bible, the chapters that we are reading tonight were taken out of those Bibles.
Yeah.
These stories of Shifra and Puah, of Moses and of Pharaoh's daughter were never taught to the slaves to the slaves in the South, because they didn't want them to resist. And yet through song, through music, and then ultimately through escape and through the fighting in the Civil War, we start to see the change.
Yeah.
The resistance happening.
That's exactly right. And even in those times, Michael, it was literally against the law for Black people to learn to read. You could die. You would be killed if you were educated. And this is exactly right. And it's really, really challenging because a lot of people today don't respect or have any reverence or have any desire to read the Bible, because it is very true that many scriptures were used to keep Black people enslaved here in America. And it is also challenging that when you see in the same church a sign that says Jesus Christ is Lord, the same church that has the cross, the symbol of the cross, but in that same church, on that same pulpit where they had the Holy Bible, stood white men in white sheets and white caps called the Ku Klux Klan, who would religiously, after church, make sure that part of their worship was killing, maiming, destroying a Black person, a Black family, a Black community. And many of those challenges and that pain still exists today. I'll tell you, we'll ask folks to just put in the chat, when is it time to act? You know, when is resistance more passive, right? How do we, what are your thoughts, those of you all that are in this class? Can you put some thoughts in the chat? Krishna, I'll just read one of yours, by singing some songs to signal it was a time to escape. That's exactly how they communicated, through music, signed, written, things written on a tree or notes. Pretty amazing. And both Blacks and Jews have demonstrated many different kinds of resistance to hardship, to cruelty, and to oppression.
I
You know,
love-
one of our goals is to share a variety of ways that we have resisted. What has that looked like?
I just want to add a thought while
Please.
people are thinking about this, that the very last words of the chapter, I don't want to skip over them,
Uh-huh.
says that a long time after that, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites were groaning under the bondage and cried out, and their cry for help from the bondage rose up to God. God heard their moaning, but God remembered God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites and God took notice of them. So I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
What did God forget the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What triggered God's memory? And why would a groan from a people at a moment after this Pharaoh who had visited all these horrible things on the Israelites now died? And Moses is somewhere else. He's in Midian. He's escaped. And the people they moan. And possibly they're moaning because maybe things are going to change. And with the death of this terrible despot, maybe. But when you groan, there is an act of self-realization. If you say that something hurts, you are acknowledging your own pain. But what happens to people who are kept down so long and no one hears them when they cry out? What happens to that person when they give up and stop crying out? And maybe God only hears us when we have enough self-understanding to appreciate our own humanness, that it's not okay, that it is not coming to me, or I don't accept what society says about me because of the color of my skin or because of my religion, but I say no. And I'm going to announce that pain. And I think about what's happening in our society, and that's where change begins, where people begin to cry out and say, this is not okay. I will not accept it. I will not be silent. And I think that that's the lesson here at the end of the chapter.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, I mean, you raise an amazing question. And I believe that a lot of times groaning provokes divine intervention. I believe that a lot of times groaning is almost a confession to God that I feel this is bigger than me. I think many times groaning is a clarion call to God to say, hey, I need you to intervene. I need you to get involved. So could it be groaning in many cases is an invitation of interference from God? Could it be it's a text message, an inbox, a DM, just a call to God? Hey, you hear this? It's beyond my capacity. It's beyond my capacity. It's beyond my control. This is too big for my own hands. And I believe that a lot of times, from the Christian perspective, God would often not get involved until we get to that place of groaning, because a lot of times we think we can do it on our own. We think we can handle it on our own. We think that we have the solution to all of the problems. We have all of the answers to all of the questions. But a groaning suggests I need other assistance, right? I can simply bring it all the way down to the fact that what pains us individually is really, really different when the pain is felt collectively.
Right, but unless you're crying out in pain,
that's right.
Unless when you stop feeling that I'm not worth it, and no one's going to listen to me anyway, it's over. I made a reference to concentration camps. They used to refer to people who gave up, who simply wanted to die. There are people who walked over and just grabbed onto the electric fence because they couldn't take it anymore. They gave up. Or people who simply stopped eating and they became what are called Musulman, and they were about to die. And listen, this is, and I want to be very clear about this. I'm not sitting in judgment of anyone because none of us know how we would have responded in that
Absolutely.
situation. But I do want to say that we should understand that an act of resistance is saying no to those who want to kill you, no to those who want to take away your human identity, even though you had a number on your arm or that you had a brand on your arm as a slave, but say, no, I am a human being and you can't rob me from that. And sometimes, and groaning and speaking out and expressing your anger is part of that humanity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or as Krishna said, when people give up and stop crying out, groaning, that's when we die, whether it be a physical death or an emotional death or a spiritual death. I do want to go back to a question, Chris, that Abe Trieger raised. He said, I want to know what Reverend Harris's view of Malcolm X and whether Malcolm X had a more realistic view of the limitation of the passive resistance or reliance on the good faith of whites than MLK. What would you say to that?
Yeah, you see, as someone who has a little bit of Martin in him and a little bit of Malcolm in him, and let me just go ahead and say a little bit of Marcus Garvey in him, right? When you think about all of these folks who were great examples of various kinds of resistance for African Americans or Black people in general, because when you think about Marcus Garvey, he did not limit himself to the plight of African Americans. It was Pan-Africanism. It was Black people, period, anyone with Black skin. I do think that, no one can deny, let's see what that sound is. I need somebody to mute. If you're typing right now, that's you. Mute your phone.
I thought people were applauding wildly. I couldn't.
Yeah, that was an applause for what I just said. So, I think I think Malcolm had his role to play. In a lot of cases, he did say by any means necessary. That was true, right? Because at some point, you do have to defend yourself, right? I think he was right for calling out a lot of the things. Sometimes you can do the right thing the wrong way, right? And we've all proven that we can do the wrong thing the right way, right? Consistently. But I think in a lot of cases, Malcolm was absolutely right. What I love about Malcolm, if you really study his story and not just watch the movies or look at the pieces when he was with the Nation of Islam, because there is a pre and during and post Malcolm when it came to the Nation of Islam. And there is also a pre and post Dr. King. A lot of people only know the I Have a Dream Dr. King, but they don't know the guy who got sick of the speeches and got tired of the dream and was refusing and resisted ignoring the nightmare that Black people were living. And King got extremely radical. Matter of fact, I think it is exactly when Malcolm, when Dr. King started to shift and change and say, wait a minute, now we need to change the way that we play the game. That's what got him killed. As long as he was marching peacefully, nonviolent, as long as he was giving great speeches, many people loved him. Not everybody, but many people loved him. But when he started to say, hey, Operation Bread Basket, let's stop helping, let's stop contributing to the economic wealth of white people. Let's start boycotting with our money. Oh, that's when they changed their mind about Dr. King. And many of the people that were marching with him started marching away from him. So I love a lot of the things that Malcolm did and don't agree with a lot of the ways that Malcolm did it, but I think they both contributed in amazing ways. And I think they both had assignments from God for our community.
Let me talk for a minute about how this tension plays out in the Jewish community.
Sure.
So the world commemorates the Holocaust at the end of January, and the date is tied to the liberation of Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
But in Israel, and the Jewish people at large follow the example of Israel, Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day, is commemorated in April. Why is that? Because they're not tying it to the liberation of Auschwitz. They're tying it to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, right? So that in the Warsaw Ghetto, there were Jews who collected armaments, guns, pistols, and they were able to hold off the Nazis for a few weeks, which was seen as an act of great physical resistance. And so when the state of Israel was established, the question was, what day do we commemorate the Holocaust on? And it's of interest that Israelis who were teaching Jews to fight for their own country and join the army would not ascribe to a vision where Jews were passively resisting, that instead they wanted to attach the day to that resistance. And that tension, by the way, is still alive and well in the Jewish community. So when you talk about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and how people of color are trying to understand, which is the right way, and the frustration of both, the Jewish community has its own way of dealing with this. And American Jewry approach the Holocaust one way, and Jews in Israel are approaching the Holocaust in a different way. Just to finish this, in Israel is called Yom HaShoah Ugvura, which means Holocaust Remembrance Day and courage and bravery. And in America, we simply refer to it as Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. So this tension about what is resistance and how do we remember that, our history is very much bound in that.
And that's exactly right. And I know that we have about 11 minutes left. And I just got to say thank you to all of you all that are joining us. And it is my hope that you joined us last week and you joined us tonight. We have about 10 minutes left or so. And I hope you will consider joining us again next week. And we promise to make sure we got the Zoom information right.
Yeah,
But let me tell you, even on March 25th of every year, Rabbi, there is an International Day of Remembrance for the victims of slavery, and the transatlantic slave trade, right, on March 25th.
Why was that date chosen? Do you happen to know?
Say it again.
Why was that date chosen?
Well, I really don't know why that specific day, right? But they acknowledged it, and there was a memorial I remember talked about that is erected over at the United Nations headquarters in New York, right?
Oh.
And they unveiled that memorial, right, on that particular day. And I got to tell you, it is pretty amazing to me that a lot of people don't even realize 15 million men, women, children. Let me say it again, 15 million. And if you talk to some, they would say 60 million, right? Depending on the studies. But let's just start with the term anywhere between 15 million and 60 million. Here's the reality. Who really knows the real number? And a lot of people don't even take time to remember the pain, the trauma, the history, and why that trauma is yet pervasive today. And I just want to believe that many of those folks resisted back then, and the way that they resisted back then took courage. And we're seeing now that we need much of that courage to show up again.
Yeah.
Right? That's where we really lose it. If we stop our act of groaning, right? If we stop our voices from being heard, if we become silent, or if we just settle with a conversation with one another, but ignore the confrontation toward the circumstance. If we allow people to just post on social media, that's a shame. But we don't get involved, then guess what? We are quiet. And a lot of people ask the question, what about the Black Panthers? You know, that comes up quite a bit. And
Right.
their way of doing it, right? Were they too aggressive? Or not, was Dr. King not aggressive enough? I think a lot of times you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't. I'll give you yet another example of resistance. I was so proud, brought tears to my eyes on last night. I don't know if people on here like the All-Star game, but the NBA players, a lot of the hockey players, soccer players, people around the world wearing shirts that say Black Lives Matter, jerseys that speak against anti-Blackness, speak against racism. Amazing. And for the first time ever, as an NBA fan, they sang the Black National Anthem. Lift every voice and sing. Just amazing. And a lot of people in my friendship circle in the Jewish community is like, wait, Pastor Harris, what do you mean Black National Anthem? There's actually a Black National Anthem? Absolutely. And they sang it last night, right before the All-Star game happened. Black people went crazy on social media because we didn't know it was going to happen. There it was, an acknowledgement. And resistance, right? Resistance, powerful statements from not only the NBA, but particularly the players.
Right. So I want to, as we're kind of coming to a conclusion here, I want to note that at the beginning, we talked about the interview that took place yesterday.
Yeah.
Which, as you said so eloquently, really speaks to the simmering, racism that is still very much alive and well, even in the palace. And at the same time, there was this remarkable moment of change going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a sense, it is the result of resistance. That's sort of the fruits of the labor, if you will. It was, as you said, it was a major, powerful step. Anybody who watched it couldn't help but, I think, become emotional on some level. It was, what a powerful idea. And, I want to remind everybody that Dr. King wrote, and if you haven't read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, you have to read it, because you'll see a different side of Dr. King, and what was he doing? He was castigating clergy, both black and white, who were saying, look how far you've come. Let's just kind of cool your jets. Let's quiet down. Just, it's enough. Let's not rock the boat. And he said, what are you talking about? And he spoke with a prophetic voice. So we can't allow ourselves to forget that as well. Where, the fact that when we make progress, that doesn't mean you stop. It means that we just it keeps going. I think someone wrote that a little, in the chat, but I think that is right. Todd wrote, when we understand that resistance will be a lifelong action, for as long as there are days on a calendar, there will be opportunity and space given to racism, both on the macro and micro level. This is an unfortunate truth. And he ends by quoting from W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, a system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect, which is it's a very interesting statement. But at the same time, we're going to have to make it what it can be, even though it's going to take time. So I just want to stop for a minute with Chris and just talk a little bit about what we've talked about tonight. Anybody knows anything about a good sermon, you tell people what you're going to say, you say it, and you tell people what you said. So, can't help it.
Well, it's been exciting. And I want to say thank you to my good friend, Carol Makoff, who said, in solidarity with our friends at Bright Star, we should all learn the Black National Anthem. Let me tell you the chills that would send down our congregation. I'm always singing, Kolod Baleva Panima Nefesh Yehuti. Come on, what is a black dude from the hood sing the Israeli national anthem? Thank God I had my rabbi help me with much of the terminology. But if we had Jewish people singing and learning and teaching the Black national anthem, it really speaks to solidarity. And tonight, that's why this conversation has been powerful. We're learning each other's language. We're seeing things through each other's lens. We talked about the dangers of othering. We talked about the different forms of resistance in the Bible. We talked about different forms of resistance in both of our communities, amazing matriarchs and patriarchs. We also talked about a little bit the dangers of doing too little and the challenges of doing too much, right? And we were able to hear a few historic examples. What we'll ask you all to do in the chat is, as we honor those who have gone on before us and whose shoulders we stand upon, if you know some great resistors who were courageous enough to get in good trouble, put their names in the chat so that we can make sure that we remember them, and may their memories be a blessing.
I just want to say, I want to just underscore what Krishna wrote. We are so much better together. We are so much better together. And I will pledge to you that we're going to make an effort at Anshe to learn the Black National Anthem. And if I sing off key, then you'll have to forgive me. But I just think it's great. So some of the names are Colin Kaepernick, Tiffany Haddish. It's a wonderful way to end our program tonight. And let's continue working and going forward. Susan Widener.
Amazing.
And Pastor Harris, would you honor us by singing a little bit of, while these names are coming up, sing something to end our session today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll close with, we are not afraid. We are not afraid. We are not afraid today. Oh, deep in our hearts, we do believe that we shall overcome. Oh, we'll walk hand in hand. We shall overcome. God bless you all.
God bless everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Next week, we're talking about redemption. Looking forward to it and looking forward to being together again. Good night.
Thank you so much. Love you guys. Take care. Have a good night. See you next week.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Pastor Harris. We'll make sure next week is fixed in terms of our Zoom link.
You're doing a great job, Amy. Thank you. Take care. Be well.
Good night.